It's the 1960s. The Beatles were dominating the music industry. People were watching TV in color for the first time. At a point, it felt like every week there was a new invention or discovery. All this was happening while the Soviet Union was conquering the final frontier: space. The Soviets were stacking achievements, and the Americans couldn't catch a break. Every time they looked at magazines, there seemed to be another Soviet headline celebrating another impossible milestone. First satellite in space, first animal in space, the first woman in space. Then, in 1961, in response to the Soviet achievements, President John F. Kennedy proposed something much bigger.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength, as well as our convictions, have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. Finally, if we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe we possess all the resources and talents necessary, but the facts of the matter are that we have never made the national decisions or marshaled the national resources required for such leadership. We have never specified long-range goals on an urgent time schedule or managed our resources and our time so as to ensure their fulfillment. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period.
After his announcement, some people thought he had lost his mind because, at the time, America hadn't even sent a man into orbit. Nevertheless, he petitioned Congress to increase NASA's budget, and he made it a national policy to land a man on the moon. So they set out on the mission, and you know how it ends. Apollo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Finally, on Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on another heavenly body. The mission was a success. America won. But wait, where are the Soviets? I mean, they were winning, weren't they? What happened? To understand what happens next, let me introduce you to one man, Sergei Korolev. Korolev was the mastermind behind the entire Soviet space program, and his influence is unparalleled among all of their achievements. At a time when the Soviet Union seemed unstoppable, he was the man leading the charge, which is why, when his untimely death came in 1966 during surgery treating a tumor, the Soviet space program suddenly had a major gap to fill. Enter Vasily Mishin. He was a talented, seasoned engineer who had worked closely with Korolev, and he succeeded to the role of chief designer of the Soviet space program. The Soviet Union already had rockets that were capable of reaching orbit, but that was it. The moon was a completely different conversation. The engines were far too weak, and they needed a lot of fuel, so they had to go bigger. But building new, bigger rocket engines required a whole new approach, years of R&D, and resources the Soviets simply couldn't afford. Mishin had to make a tough decision: build a new rocket engine or use their refined ones. Now, at the time, of course, the latter option made more sense. Use their refined rocket engines and just build a bigger rocket. Enter the N-1, the largest and most ambitious rocket the Soviet Union had ever attempted to build. If successful, it would carry Soviet cosmonauts to the moon and potentially secure one of the greatest victories in history. So they fitted the N-1 with 30 smaller, refined rocket engines. While this approach made sense on paper, managing 30 engines simultaneously would prove to be a challenge unlike anything Soviet engineers had attempted before. Despite the challenges, they pressed ahead. On February 21st, 1969, the countdown began. Years of hard work, development, and testing lead to this moment. In true Soviet fashion, the most important launch of their lunar program would also double as its first real test. For a brief moment, it looked like they have pulled it off. The situation could only worsen. Launch 2. Soviet engineers investigated the rocket, made modifications, and convinced themselves the major issues had been addressed. So, a few months later, on July 3rd, 1969, they tried again. Now this was a huge deal because Apollo 11 was only weeks away from launch. The pressure was on. Failed, and the Soviets would suffer the biggest defeat they had faced in the space race. Catastrophe. Seconds after liftoff, things began to go wrong. One engine failed, then another, then another. What followed was a chain reaction that quickly spiraled out of control. Before anyone could react, the N-1 lost control, fell back toward the launch pad, and exploded. The explosion was so powerful that it became the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history at the time. 17 days later, Apollo 11 launched, making the Americans the victors aboard the Saturn V. But the N-1 could still save face and provide some comfort to the Soviet Union by reaching the moon. After all, it was one of the greatest engineering marvels ever built. But attempt after attempt, the N-1 failed. A third launch failed, then a fourth. Years passed, confidence faded, and the Soviet moon program began to lose support. With Apollo 11 already victorious and the N-1 still unable to reach orbit, the dream was becoming harder and harder to justify. Eventually, Vasily Mishin lost his position as chief designer. The N-1 program was cancelled, and Soviet dreams of landing a man on the moon came to an end. What was once supposed to be the Soviet Union's answer to the Saturn V had become a symbol of one of its greatest failures, and for many, the N-1 would go down as the rocket that lost the moon.